Fantasy as a genre has an extremely damaging history with race. The progenitor of the genre space, Tolkien's Middle-earth legendarium, does not feature characters who are non-white prominently, with other racialized groups not being other humans but entirely different species, perpetuating extremely harmful propaganda about non-white people being literally entirely different than white people on a fundamental physiological level. Tolkien even stated directly that the orcs were based on stereotypes of Asian people in his letters to one of his colleagues, and though the Easterlings aren't literally a different species, they're also fairly easily determined to be stereotypes of Asian people. Tolkien's work then went on to influence every other work of Western fantasy fiction ever created, and eventually that influence spread on to The Legend of Zelda, which also perpetuates the harmful idea that other races are literally inhuman, and even worse, that some are ontologically evil. In The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, the bestial long-standing series main villain Ganon is given a human counterpart named Ganondorf, based on a previously mentioned human version of the character from previous main Nintendo dev team Zelda game A Link to the Past's instruction manual. Ganondorf is the main villain of this game, but it's the culture that he was born from that is the focus of this video. Invented by Ocarina of Time are the people known as the Gerudo, a group that lives deep within the desert in Hyrule and that Ganondorf leads. The Gerudo are Orientalist stereotypes of cultures in Swana, standing for Southwest Asia, North Africa, the fetishization of their women that Orientalism is largely founded on, perpetuated uncritically and wholly here. The Gerudo are a culture almost entirely composed of women aside from Ganondorf himself, a race of people entirely built out of harem stereotypes. The way they dress is entirely composed of ridiculous belly dancer outfits invented entirely by Westerners during the initial Orientalist art movement. Worse, the Gerudo are the only non-white culture within Zelda. While we do see non-white people in Hyrulean culture within some of the later entries, they do not have any distinct culture of their own, faceless NPCs who occasionally have some personality. The Gerudo are the only non-white entity that have their own identity in contrast to Hyrule's whiteness, and that identity is rooted in harmful stereotypes and ideas. They even worship a different goddess than those in Hyrule do, the goddess of the sands, who the games go to show does not exist, essentially arguing non-white religions aren't real. At worst, the Gerudo are an evil race trying to conquer the pure and noble Hyrule, and at best they're temptresses who steal away Hylian men, as a townsperson in Hyrule Castletown puts it. Of course, the game also features a one of the good ones narrative in the character Naboru, who is one of the sages that Link frees on his journey to defeat Ganondorf. She is the ideal marginalized individual to these systems of abuse in that she doesn't oppose the imperial state of Hyrule in any way, assisting the protagonists in perpetuating it once more by defeating the only renegade who sought to dismantle its power structures. Ganondorf is, of course, vilified for his justifiable radicalism. He only sought to free his people from the oppression of Hyrule. He is literally transformed into the form of a gigantic boar to be slain by the white hero of the games, an animal to be slaughtered. His humanity is removed from him due to striking back in the name of his people. The Legend of Zelda: Majora's Mask, the direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, takes a different turn with the Gerudo. While they look identical, they now take the role of pirates. This changes nothing about them functionally. They still dress the same and have the same Orientalist connotations of being an entire race of dangerous and attractive foreign women, aside from the one of the good ones narrative surrounding Naboru. Instead, there are no good ones, leading to the classic fantasy racist argument of pure evil races once more. One side quest in the game even features the player assisting a white fisherman with acquiring a photo of one of them to ogle, their position as a fetish object even more reinforced here. With that being said, there is not much else to say about them in this particular entry. One of the few facets of Majora's Mask that I find hard to mine and find cavernous depth for conversation. The Wind Waker does not feature the Gerudo as a racial group in any other way than Ganondorf's role within the game, but the way Ganondorf is characterized in this text informs interpretations of him within all the other Zelda games as well. Ganondorf's Wind Waker incarnation is the best written of all of them, and it's through him that the best ideas about the Gerudo are posited. This is the first admission that the Gerudo aren't an inherently evil race, but instead a group fighting against the colonial forces of Hyrule. Ganondorf is still framed as the villain because Zelda is still abhorrently racist, but we learn his motivations for doing what he did throughout all the games straight from his mouth. He wanted to liberate his people from the shackles of Hyrule, save them from the Western world that systemically abused them. This is also the only appearance of Ganondorf where he isn't literally transformed into a gigantic monster. He is human through and through, the games recognizing him as more than a beast for the one and only time. This is all made even more interesting with the context of the Wind Waker's opening. Prior to the events of the Wind Waker, there was a point in time where Link was not present to stop Ganondorf's righteous anger, and he invaded Hyrule. Instead of cede any ground to the people they had abused for millennia, the people of Hyrule pled to their goddesses and had the land swept away by a massive flood. They would rather kill the majority of their population and turn the entire world into a near uninhabitable ocean than ever let the Gerudo have a single victory. The systems of colonialism will do anything to prevent their victims from having any victory, even if they destroy themselves. And that is how the Wind Waker ends, with Hyrule burying itself once more at the behest of its king solely to erase the Gerudo and their legacy. While the Gerudo appear in The Legend of Zelda: Four Swords Adventures, that game is one that would go better off unacknowledged. There is nothing of interest to say about any of the symbols from the games that it shamelessly copies without further iteration or commentary. The next true appearance of the Gerudo in the series is Ganondorf's appearance in The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess as a foil to his role in The Wind Waker, much like many ideas in that game are. Both are the last of their kind, destroyed by Hyrule. But while the Hyruleans of the Wind Waker destroyed themselves in order to ensure that their victims never saw any prosperity, the Hyruleans of Twilight Princess were somehow far more grotesque. The Gerudo do not appear in this game in spite of there being no apocalyptic biblical flood, Twilight Princess's world still an antediluvian haven. The hints to what happened to the Gerudo are all in the dungeon known as the Arbiter's Grounds, the place where Ganondorf's execution was attempted. This dungeon, in stark contrast to many Zelda dungeons, is a literal dungeon. It was a prison for the Gerudos. They were systemically eradicated from Hyrule by the colonizers who had taken everything from them. It's even built on their holy grounds, effigies of the goddess of the sands from Ocarina of Time's spirit temple littering the architecture of the location. The extermination of the Gerudo was done on the single order of a white child at the end of Ocarina of Time, when Link tells the Hyrulean royalty what Ganondorf intends to do despite having no evidence of any wrongdoing, and the story of their death is not even spoken of within Twilight Princess's text. It's a silent crime against humanity, one the game doesn't view as important enough to even bring up. This is in stark contrast to the Twilight, whose prison is what the Arbiter's Grounds were built around. The Twilight get ample empathy from the game's text, one of the main characters being the Twilight Midna, who is seen as cute and mischievous, if a little cruel at first. Contrast this with the Gerudo, whose only framing is through Ganondorf, which the game sees as a vicious and malignant tumor. The Twilight are the model minorities, aside from the villainous Zant, who is being manipulated by the aggressive Ganondorf anyway, and ends up being the one to deliver the killing blow to Ganondorf at the game's end, showing that he has redeemed himself in the eyes of the White Hegemony. And the game argues that they must be protected from the evil touch of the Gerudo, even allowing Midna at the end to sever the connection between the realm of shadow and the realm of light to achieve self-determination for her people. After all, they're the paler of the two groups, aren't they? Their suffering is more valuable to the game than that of Ganondorf and his people who have vanished without a trace. Not mysteriously or ethereally, but in a revoltingly cold and calculated fashion. The Gerudo would lie dormant as an idea within the Zelda games for over a decade after this point. Ganondorf would appear in Hyrule Warriors, but there's not much to talk about with that game, as it's in a similar vein to Four Swords Adventures. The symbols of Zelda are utterly meaningless, distilled to their basic brand identities. With that being said, the next two games up for analysis may also have that same criticism levied at them. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the games that brought the Gerudo back after their decade-long hiatus from Zelda consciousness. The Gerudo Town section in Breath of the Wild is utterly abhorrent, a display of the game's Orientalism to their fullest. The Gerudo at their most fetishized in their designs, and othered even more than they were in previous entries. In this game, they are framed as deviants. This game sees gender fluidity as a predatory thing, and that the Gerudo allow and encourage it unlike any other culture. The game sees transness as harmful. It directly engages in the tired old transphobic rhetoric of men dressing like women in order to enter women's spaces, and blames the Gerudo for allowing something like that to occur. Transness is bad because the Gerudo allow it, and the Gerudo are bad because they allow transness, Breath of the Wild posits. Link even dresses up in the Orientalist garb of the Gerudo, and it's played off as funny. To hammer the perceived incompetence of the Gerudo even further, their leader is a literal child, the game thinking their culture immature. The one other notable Gerudo character who we meet in this game is the former champion of the Gerudo, which perished a century before the game's events. Herself a warrior woman stereotype who still recognizes the white Princess Zelda as her superior. The only reason the game even sees the Gerudo as worth interacting with at all is because they have rejected Ganon, rejected the one who fought for their liberation. The Gerudo of Breath of the Wild are ashamed of him, and thus reinforce the white supremacist state of Hyrule, even when it no longer exists. Even when they make those concessions to that state, they are still viewed as a hostile other. Speaking of Ganon, he also makes an appearance in Breath of the Wild, but much like so many of his appearances, he's stripped of his personhood. Once more a beast to be slain, an obstacle for the hero to overcome in order to save a white woman whose safety is the most protected thing in the entire Western world. Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity takes place in the same world as Breath of the Wild and also features the Gerudo prominently. However, there is nothing to be said about that game that the other games aren't already conveying, much like the other spin-off titles that utilize the series' symbols. Tears of the Kingdom also takes place within the same spaces as Breath of the Wild and utilizes many of the same ideas. However, unique to it is that Gerudo Town is now completely abandoned, as a sandstorm has taken over the entirety of the area that was once the city. Of course, this has led the Gerudo unable to do anything for themselves, their entire existence reliant on the help of a white savior in the form of Link's influence on them. It's an already egregious addition to Breath of the Wild's heinous Orientalism, but in addition to this, the game features the return of Ganondorf the person as opposed to the fragmented, bestial malice of the last game. Once more, he is framed as a malignant entity to further the narrative of fearing the other. This time, however, they do one of the most vile things that the series has ever done. Ganondorf possesses Zelda's body throughout the course of the game. This already occurred for a brief period in Twilight Princess as a boss fight, but here it is extended for the entire narrative. The white woman's body violated by the evil racial other, the sanctity and purity of the Western world completely breached. This is the ultimate in Orientalist propaganda, the ultimate horrific racist accusation levied against Swana, the desolation of the sanctity of the bodies of white women, something the West has used as a bludgeon time and time again against Eastern cultures, inventing perceived victims in order to justify endless slaughter. And once more, at the game's end, we fight against Ganon, reduced to a mindless draconic animal, robbed of his humanity yet again. Tears of the Kingdom is impressive in the extent of its Orientalist ideology, the lengths it goes to dehumanize the Gerudo, even in the face of an already disgusting portrayal across the series. And the worst part is that nobody seems to care. The Gerudo have a long and awful history within the Zelda series, Orientalist stereotypes that have persisted since Ocarina of Time in their entirety up until the most recent release. One of the most abhorrently racist mainstays in gaming, proportional to how few people seem to criticize it. This has been Arcagent Everlasting, who thinks it's very good that the Fire Temple chanting was removed from later versions of Ocarina of Time, actually, signing off. Thank you for watching.